Start the recording. Okay, great. Well, welcome to today's Consciousness Club. As I said before, feel free to leave your videos on. It's nice for the speaker to be able to see your faces, but if you can just make sure you're muted so we don't get interference, and we'll use the raise hand tool to manage the Q&A towards the end. So real pleasure to have Liad Mudrik joining us from increasingly vaccinated Tel Aviv, as we've just been hearing, so that's exciting. So Liad, I just learned from your CV, I didn't actually know this, that you completed 2 PhDs, which is incredibly impressive, at Tel Aviv University. So she did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, supervised by Dominic Lamy and Leon Duell, and a PhD in philosophy, which was supervised by Marcelo Dascal. And then she went on to do a postdoc on a postdoctoral fellowship at Caltech, working with Christoph Koch and Ralph Adolphs. And then in 2015, returned to Israel to start her own lab as a faculty member at Tel Aviv University's School of Psychological Science and the Segal School of Neuroscience. So Liad's done some fantastic and innovative work at this cutting edge of consciousness science. And I think what we'll hear today, she's also taken the lead on work comparing between different theories of consciousness, which is such an important enterprise for the field. So glad that you're doing this, Liad, and really looking forward to your talk. So take it away.
Thank you so much. And I'm very happy to be here and happy to see many familiar faces and new faces that I'll be happy to get to know. And today I'm going to talk about theories of consciousness. And indeed, as you probably felt yourself, so first I'll just say that I'll describe the theories, some prominent theories in the field, and then move on to ask what are the critical differences between these theories. And then I can't find a proper place to put all your faces. And then I'm going to ask, how are they supported? And finally, can we arbitrate between them? And indeed, when we talk about theories of consciousness, it seems as if the field in the last several years has moved from focusing mostly on the neural correlates of consciousness to us actually trying to understand the theories that we have in the field and how can we understand them better and test them better. And one thing that you actually see is that there is an emerging interest in also comparing between the theories. So just in last year, there were 2 very interesting papers that discussed the differences between the theories and tried to compare them. We are looking forward to a new issue in the Neuroscience of Consciousness journal that is solely focused on theories of consciousness and how we can arbitrate between them and understand them better. So it seems as if the field is gradually moving towards from collecting data, empirical data, and kind of increasing our database to also trying to test the different accounts of consciousness that have emerged in past years. And there have been many, right? So when we think about theories of consciousness, this is a completely impartial list. So we have GNW and we have IIT and higher order thought and recurrent processing and micro consciousness and attentional schema theory, which seems to be gaining popularity, predictive processing, of course, and synchronization accounts. So there are many different theories. Here, I'm going to focus on 4, these 4. For several reasons. So I think, generally speaking, when you inspect different venues, when they talk about theories of consciousness, these 4 are the ones that are typically mentioned, typically studied and compared. And this is also what I'm going to do today. So I'm not saying that these are the most popular theories. I'm not saying that these are potentially the best theories. I'm just saying that these are the theories that have been mostly discussed and studied in the field. I am not sure, and maybe let me know in this crowd how much I need to present the 4 theories. I can do it in a nutshell, unless everyone here already knows all about the 4 theories.
I think we quite often have students on the call as well, so I think it'd be useful just to give a little bit of background. That'd be great.
Okay, so I should give a disclaimer at the start, because each one of these theories deserves, a complete seminar that focuses solely on that theory and explains it in full. So I probably won't do justice to the theories, but I'll do my best to give a short overview so everyone here is on the same page. So GNW, Global Neuronal Workspace, was suggested by Stanislas Dehaene and Lionel Nakash, but it's actually based on the work of Bernard Bars, which put forward a psychological model that was then translated into a neuroscientific theory by Dehaene and Nakash. And the idea there is fairly, well, I don't know if it's simple, but it's clear, I think. So when you think about unconscious processing, which is what you see on the left, then you have encapsulated areas, encapsulated modules that are being activated by information that we process, but does not cross some threshold. Once this threshold is crossed, it is amplified by attention. It enters this global workspace, which is some kind of a central system that is able to then broadcast that information back throughout the brain. It allows then integrative processes and interactions between different areas and different modules. So, and this workspace is held to be mediated by pyramidal neurons that are located mostly in frontal areas. This is a frontal and parietal network. Once again that the stimulus is amplified by attention, it goes through a dynamic mobilization that grants that makes it accessible for us to report, and also for all other brain areas to kind of interact with. It's a global broadcasting mechanism, and it's important to note that indeed access is a key feature of GNW. And I'll talk about the differences between access and phenomenology in a second. So as far as GNW is concerned, this workspace is being ignited in a phasic manner about 250 milliseconds after the stimulus is presented, and then the signal decays. So the system kind of works from one ignition to another, so that it does not necessarily maintain its activity, maintain its activity throughout the percept, but it will ignite and then go back to baseline until a new percept emerges. Another theory is, of course, integrated information theory, originally put forward by Tononi and Edelman in a science paper, but then further developed and substantially developed by Tononi himself, and in recent years joined by Christoph Koch, who became one of the major proponents of the theory. And IIT is complicated to explain. It took me a lot of time to better understand it. But the idea there, again, in a nutshell, is that Tononi says, and his team, what are the 5 axioms that characterize each and every experience, so that they are both necessary and sufficient for that. This combination is necessary and sufficient for any conscious experience one might have. And note that as opposed to GNW, the starting point is not science. It's not scientific facts, but actually phenomenology. So they kind of contemplate on the aspects of consciousness. They identify 5 axioms. I won't go into them now. From these axioms, they derive postulates. So they now ask, given each one of these characteristics, what is needed of a physical system in order to implement that? So the question here is, and they develop all these mathematical computations and tests in order to derive the famous phi that would allow them to then ask how conscious is a system. And IIT then claims, based on anatomical considerations and the connectivity patterns of a parietal and a posterior, cortex as opposed to anterior one, that this major complex that is the physical substance giving rise to consciousness should reside in the back of the head. So the major complex is what they call the posterior hot zone. And one of the things that happened, which I think we should also kind of be wary of, is that the debate is centered around back versus front of the brain, which I think is more complicated than that. I'll get to that later on. Importantly, as opposed to GNW, the entire kind of philosophy of neuroscience is different here. Because here for IIT, there is no signal that is being shared and then broadcasted to other areas. They don't talk in terms of representations even. There is a state of the brain that is then unfolded into, I won't go into that, into the cause-effect structure. Happy to discuss that with everyone who is interested later on. And that structure is identical to consciousness. So each state generates a specific qualia, specific experience, rather than having a signal that is being transmitted or shared. And as opposed to GNW, they maintain that this state should continue as long as I experience that specific experience. So there is no kind of update and then going back to baseline. Higher order thought. So there are many streams for that, and I apologize that I won't cover all of them. I'll just focus on a key paper that was put forward by, so the original philosophical idea came from David Rosenthal. Hak-Wan Lau then translated that into neuroscience, and since then we have different versions of that. Ledoux and Clearman suggested recently other versions for higher order thought. And the idea there is that if you have the first order representations that reside in sensory areas, that is not enough for a state to become conscious. So we need another higher order state to point at these primal representations and say, I am conscious of this now. So we need kind of another mechanism to do that. And this mechanism is typically ascribed to dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, at least in the Lau version. And importantly, another aspect of higher order thought is that there should be no difference in performance between conscious and unconscious processing. And they actually focus on paradigms which is very interesting, where they can equate objective performance, but subjective experience is different. And last but not least is first order theories or recurrent processing in this case, mostly advocated by Victor Lame, but also in line with the philosopher Ned Block. And there, the idea is that, I don't know if it's the exact opposite, but it's some kind of an opposite to higher order thought, under the idea that the first order representations themselves give you phenomenal consciousness. And when attention is added, then you might also have access to it. But even without attention, it's already a form of consciousness that you have. So the attention is like an additional layer that comes, but consciousness can take place even for unattended stimuli. And it all depends on recurrent processing, as the name implies. But these are local kind of recurrent processes. So once you have recurrent processing from, for example, V4 to V1, then you would have a conscious experience. So now, how can we differentiate between these theories? I've given you an overview, but we can now ask different types of questions. And I think, as I said before, that the typical question that people usually ask is it the back of the brain or the front of the brain? And when you then divide the theories to camps, you get GNW and higher order thought in the frontal camp, and IIT and RPT in the posterior one. But you could also ask, what are the theories trying to explain? And here you get an interesting picture, because GNW focuses on access. They assume that with access comes phenomenology, but they explicitly write the way to study consciousness is via report. We want to ask what is happening when someone has an experience and can, in principle, report it. You don't have to physically report it, but you have to be able to report it. You have to have access to the experience. For higher order thought, I think it's mostly about, and again, these are all my characterizations. I'm happy to hear different opinions, of course. And I forgot to say that if you have questions, feel free to stop me and ask. Higher order thought, I think, is mostly about phenomenology. And they kind of assume that there is also access, because the higher order thought tells you, I am having this experience now. Access comes with it, but I think it's not that clear if it's more of a phenomenology or of an access. But definitely access is not enough, in my opinion, at least, the way I read it. IIT is mostly about phenomenology. So they say we can quantify your qualia, and we can explain everything about your qualia, and actually say, even claim at some point, there is no hard question. So there is a hard question, but we solve it, which of course also evokes a lot of criticism. And I forgot to say when talking about IIT that this is probably the most hotly debated theory in the field. But of course, with the phenomenology comes also access. And for recurrent processing, I think it's also mostly about that's what they say. It's mostly about phenomenology, and access kind of comes later with attention. So here we have a somewhat different division. We can also ask, what are the theories based on? So as I said before, GNW is based on neuroscientific findings. Higher order thought is based on philosophy. IIT is based on phenomenology, and RPT also on neuroscientific findings. So now we actually have different camps. With GNW and RPT, belonging to the same one. What about the functions of consciousness? So for GNW, there are clear functions that go with consciousness. For higher order thought, not really. You could ask whether this is about monitoring or predicting or experiencing, if you consider that a function. The same for IIT, and RPT goes with GNW. And here, I think I wouldn't expect to find higher order thought in IIT in the same camp, but sometimes that can also happen, apparently. And you can also ask, what is the defining principle of the theory? So both GNW and higher order thought are based on a functional definition, at least the way I read it. And I want to separate between functions, what I just said before, and functional principles. So here I'm talking about kind of an algorithmic way of thought. So for GNW, when I said that it's functional, the function that the network allows is global broadcasting of information. If that is in the frontal lobe or in the TPJ or in wherever that would come from, that's fine as far as they're concerned, as long as the function of global broadcasting is kept. The same for higher order thought. They don't care where is that higher order state. There just needs to be one. For IIT, it's a structural theory. The structure of the brain determines the unfolded structure and the kind of the connections between the nodes determine the qualitative aspect of experience and the amount of consciousness that a creature might have. And I think that that's also true for recurrent processing. So the type of connections, the recurrent processing themselves determine whether a state will be conscious or not. And there's also a point in agreement, I think, in all theories. So for all theories, you need some form of recurrent processing or feedback in order to get consciousness. So they don't disagree on everything. And then the next question that I would like to raise is, how are these theories supported? And here, this is the work that is done by Itai Yaron. I should say that I find this is like he has done tremendous work here, both in scope and in quality. So I should give him all the credit that I can. And it has been done in collaboration with Michael Pitts and Lucia Meloni, who are the two people with which I work on the adversarial corroboration thing, and I will describe that later on as well. So what Itai and the three of us have noticed is that we have these different theories, and each theory just seems to support itself. So it seems as if we have these different camps, each one of them gains more and more support, and it appears as if there is very little crosstalk. The field is highly, highly fractionated, and sometimes the discussions get extremely kind of hot and heated, I should say. And as I said before, you don't see many collaborations or even mutual influences. At least that is how it seemed to us when we started. And the methods are very, very heterogeneous. So what we kind of wanted to do is to ask, if we try to map kind of the sociology of the field, how have we been testing the different theories of consciousness? Will we be able to find potential trends that might explain why some theories have been supported and others have not, or why we have findings supporting each theory and there is no crosstalk? So what Itai has done was to first gather papers that we had two kind of search criteria. So one was take all the papers that mention GNW, higher order thought, IIT, or RPT in their abstract or title or topic. And then we also selected for each one of these theories 3 key papers that seemed to us as the most important ones. I'm happy to share the papers later on. And we took all the papers that cite those 3 papers, excuse me, for each theory. So then we had a database of almost 7,000 papers, and then we started to screen them out. After removing duplicates and non-English papers and so on, we were left with 884 papers that seemed relevant. Itai read all of them, screened out additional 519 papers that did not focus on that did not focus on predictions with respect to NCC. So for example, GNW also makes functional predictions, and then you have behavioral studies looking into that. We didn't focus on these types of papers, so only the neuroscience of consciousness. And we were left off with 365 365 studies reporting 412 experiments. And then what Itai did was to ask, let's see how they distribute between the theories. So one thing that is interesting is to see that GNW is the most studied theory, followed by RPT, then IIT, and higher order thought we found relatively few papers. I should say there were hundreds of papers discussing the philosophical aspects of higher order thought, but just not as many empirical papers. You can also see the difference between the division to challenging papers as opposed to supporting papers. And you can already see what seems to be a confirmation, some kind of confirmatory bias. So we tend to support the theories more than challenge them. Now, you might say that this is something that is expected because the field is relatively young, and maybe now when we mature, we will see more and more challenging papers. So Itai also inspected the effects over time. And I should say, before that, let me kind of explain. We wanted to see if also the success of one theory affects the success of another theory. So you would expect that if one theory is thriving, then the other theory should start to plateau, right? Because everyone kind of joins the other theory. But what we see actually is that this is not the case. So all four theories just gradually gain more and more support. On the left, you see papers mentioning the theories, in the middle, papers supporting the theories, and also papers challenging the theories. So we have an increase in that, but it's not kind of bigger than the increase that we have in supporting theories. So it seems as if there is no kind of, if you consider this a sign of the maturation of the field, this is not found here. So it seems as if there is limited crosstalk and just every theory strengthens, it becomes more and more supported without a mutual effect. Now, the next thing we asked then is why? Why aren't they eliminated? So one thing that could explain that is how many of the papers are theory driven. So they write in their introduction that they want to test a specific theory, as opposed to just mention the theory at some point of the paper or interpret their findings post hoc. And as you can see here, only about a third of the papers are theory driven. So they start out, or at least they write in the introduction that they started out wanting to testing the theories. I take their word for granted. And I should say generally that this mapping that we did, this is not a meta-analysis. And this is also not a critical examination. So we took the interpretation of the authors as at face value. There was no subjective judgment on our side because we didn't want to, we wanted to see how is the field treating these four theories. And you can see also, interestingly though, that when you take also only the papers that challenge the theories, there are many more theory-driven papers there. So it's not that if your paper is theory-driven, you're more likely to challenge a theory, you're still more likely to confirm it. But if your paper challenges the theory, it is most probable that you started off in a theory-driven approach, which actually makes sense because you find a finding and then you say, oh, this goes with GNW, so it supports GNW or IIT. And here again, the effect is very stable over time. So there is no change in trend. So we think that shows that there are not enough a priori tests. And I should say that only a small fraction, I think 7% of the papers actually tested more than one theory. So the prediction of more than one theory, this and comparing theories in the introduction, we didn't even see that. And then we asked, okay, so what does the data show? And what Itai did was basically to aggregate all the reported findings across all papers that support the theories. Again, this is not a statistical meta-analysis. Each paper gets 1 point, irrespective of the effect reported in that paper. When you do that, you see that the entire brain lights up as candidates for conscious experience, like correlates of consciousness. The colors represent the different theories, and I'll show you now. What I think is more alarming is that when you divide the papers to theories, so this is, as I said, this is, sorry, I forgot, this is unexplained variability because none of the theories predicts this pattern, right? But when you divide it to theories, well, then the results actually seem to support the predictions of the theory. So for RPT papers, they mostly find activation in posterior areas, visual areas. For GNW, they find frontoparietal papers. Now, to some extent, this is expected because people find something and then might interpret it in light of a theory. But in another aspect, it's troubling because it shows you that kind of we get a different picture of the results based on each on the type of paper that we read. And when we aggregate them together, no clear pattern emerges. And the same goes, and that's actually, this is when we only focus on content papers. So I should say that you can study consciousness in two ways, either by manipulating the content. So for example, presenting an image very, very quickly. Sometimes the subject sees it, sometimes she doesn't, and compare the neural activations. Or you can study state consciousness, where you, for example, compare neural activations while sleeping in non-REM or REM sleep, or in disorders of consciousness, and so on. The same pattern goes for temporal findings. So MEG and EEG, when I was expecting to find like a cluster for VAN and a cluster for P3, but when you look at the data, it doesn't even seem to go in clusters. If you didn't have the colors which represent how the authors named their components, I'm not sure you would be able to know which is P3 and which is VAN. It also shows you the kind of the freedom of interpretation that people have in naming their findings. And again, when you divide it to theories, then yes, RPT papers find early activations and GNW papers find late activations. So we don't know, but we raise the possibility that there might be some bias in the way these findings are interpreted. So the next step was to ask, okay, so how can that be? How can that be explained? And what Itai did was also to map the landscape of paradigms that are being used in the field in order to ask, could the methodological choices of the researchers determine the outcome of their paper? So what Itai did was to, and you can see that there is a big variability also when dividing it to content versus state. So using a random forest classifier, which basically, I won't go into the details because we don't have time, but it's basically creating these decision trees where each node is a parameter of the experiment. And then it does that many times, and it looks for, it tries to classify. We give as parameters, we only give the methodological aspects of the papers. Is it content? Is it state? Is there report? Is it masking? Is it attentional blindness, and so on and so forth? Is it fMRI? Is it MEG? We don't give the classifier any information about the findings, what the authors actually found. And we ask, can you decode based on the experimental parameters alone, which theory would be supported, without even knowing what the what the results were. And I should say that chance is, we define chance as the distribution of the papers to each theory, because otherwise it wouldn't have been fair. So just to explain, because GNW is the most kind of popular theory, the classifier would have been correct if it just said GNW all the time. So we kind of took that as our baseline, and we try to see whether we can do better than that. And lo and behold, we can. So we can decode in 80% accuracy when the baseline is 66, which theory is going to be predicted. We can decode it for the combination of the theories. We can decode it for each one of the theories. And we also identify which factors are most important in that decoding. And this is, again, I won't go into the details, but it's done by adding a random factor and seeing whether and running this many, many times and seeing which factors are performing better than that random factor. And we identify 4 main such factors. The first is, as you might expect, report versus no report. So when you look at the division of report versus no report findings, you see that GNW and so higher order thought is completely is exclusively report based. I should say that we didn't even include that in the classification though, because we only had 5 cases, but RPT mostly report, GNW mostly report, but not as much. And IIT is the complete reverse pattern. We should say that that is very strongly correlated with the state versus content, right? So when you only look at content papers, still you don't have the same division. So RPT and GNW about 75%, even more report, IIT less than that. But also the division to state versus content, which was another important factor, is completely biased. So IIT is mostly based on state, RPT almost solely on content, G&W some kind of a mixture. I think it's important because all the theories claim that they explain both types, so not only content consciousness and not only state consciousness. So they should be kind of tested and supported by findings from the two types of studies, but we see that that is not the case. We also find differences in the consciousness measures. So it seems like while G&W, RPT, and higher order thought are more kind of based on the classical objective versus subjective measures of consciousness, which is basically asking the subject what they saw or giving them some objective tests to see whether they're a chance or not. IIT also has different measures like sleep and state inductions and so on. But another factor is the connectivity and frequency measures that are again more prevalent in IIT and G&W, because these are theories that talk about complexity and integration, and RPT less so. So the kind of choice of analysis and methodology influences the outcome that we get. So if I sum up this line of work, we see high heterogeneity of findings with no clear picture that emerges. We ask whether the theories explain the same thing because they don't rely on the same kind of data to kind of make their points. We think that more theory-driven papers are needed. And we think that we should also shift from accumulating more and more positive evidence to directly test opposing predictions. So at least we have a chance to challenge one of the theories. And I should also say, and I hope that you will be as excited about this as I am, that all this database basically translated into an online website that we will make public within a few weeks. So then you can just go into this website and you can conduct all kind of queries. So for example, you want to find all masking papers with whatever visual stimuli and
Liad, we're seeing a gray screen.
Oh, sorry. It always happens to me when I do that from the screen. So let me just share here. Okay, so we have this website where you can just conduct all types of queries and then see the distribution of papers along the parameters that you're interested in. You can also then save it to a CSV and get the list of all the papers. So you could kind of just find all the different cuts that you want to. You could see how this divides to theories. Let's say that I want to look at content and state and both report and no report, and only the supporting or only the challenging. So you can start playing with it yourselves. Also asking which paradigms support or challenge the different theories, each one of them, all of them together. You can look at the distribution to theories for each one of the paradigms and so on. Trends over the years for different aspects, so for paradigm, for report versus no report, and so on. You can also play a little game at the end. You can see which journals are kind of more favor of the theories and of consciousness in general. And you can also look at the distribution of theories per countries of the papers that kind of published this. And I should also say that one thing that we really hope for, and we are now trying to develop, is to turn this into, we hope that this will turn, I don't know why I cannot see my screen, sorry, I want to share, let me do it again. So we hope that this would become also a major venue for people who are interested in consciousness. And we're thinking, and we'll be super happy to get your ideas on how to do so. So people could just use that also to post, positions and ask questions and so on. And another challenge is, of course, how to update it so it would be democratic and people could vet what we think are classifications and so on. So we are working on a mechanism. It will take us time. And I'm happy if anyone here is interested in helping, I'm happy to hear that. So the last part of my talk, I'm not sure how much time, okay, I'm okay with time, is about arbitrating between the theories. Steve already mentioned this initiative of adversarial collaboration, and I should say that this entire thing is the vision of one crazy person, David Potgater. I never managed to say his name right for some reason, from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, who thought that the time has come to not only accumulate more and more theories, but also try to arbitrate between them by means of adversarial collaboration. And together with Christoph Koch, he initiated the first meeting, which I had the honor and pleasure to be a part of. It took place in Seattle in March 2018 in the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And what happened there was this, for me, it was like, I keep saying that, you know, I have kids and everything, so it doesn't seem right to say that these are the best 2 days of my life, but it was pretty amazing, because we sat there, for me, you know, being a relatively young researcher with, you know, the giants of this field. There was Stan Dehaan and Giulio Tononi and Christoph and David Chalmers and Hakwon Lau, and basically with no presentations, no PowerPoints and everything, just them and a whiteboard trying to understand what their theories are and identify kind of key predictions and where we can, how to establish an experiment that would arbitrate between them. And we managed to find 2 ideas. And then at some point, I think it was Giulio who said to Michael Pitts and Lucia Meloni and myself, you are impartial because you're not affiliated with any theory. Maybe you can just draft these ideas and start working on a draft. And I didn't understand at that point that the 3 of us are getting into the biggest project, you know, I've ever been involved with, and definitely most demanding. It's been an extreme honor and pleasure to work with both Lucia and Mike. I learned so much from the 2 of them in co-leading this endeavor. So we had these very, you know, vague predictions at the start relating to different expectations of the theories. And these translated into huge tables where, for the 2 experiments that we kind of came up with, for each specific result in these experiments, what would that mean for the 2 theories, IIT and GNW? Higher order thought was a part of it at the beginning, but they actually, at some point, Hakwon decided that that's not the best venue for him to test his theory. And there is now also another initiative for higher order thought versus first order theories, that where this is tested. And this translated into a very detailed pre-registration where we detailed these 2 experiments. I won't go into the details of these experiments at this point because we are now, we hope that we will be able to make it public within 2 months or so, even less, I hope. And we'll be happy, of course, to hear your opinions. But remember that there are people working on it, so don't, you know, be harsh, but also be respectful for all the postdocs and students, so they won't be. I'm joking, of course. But the idea is that we have 2 experiments because we are excited to share it with everyone. It's kind of like our baby that we've been working on for 3 years. So we have 2 different experiments that are going to be tested in 3 techniques. So fMRI, MEG combined with EEG, and ECOG across 6 different labs. And the nice thing about it is that everything is public. So both Dehaan and Tononi actually signed letters saying, these are the experiments. I approve that I confirm that they test my predictions. And I also confirmed the interpretation of the results that is already included in the pre-registration. And now I should say, I am not diluting myself. So it's clear to me that within 3 or 4 years, when we publish the results, you know, it's not as if GNW or IIT would cease to exist, right? But I hope that to the very least, one of them would have to revise some of its, or both of them would have to revise some of its claims, because we have some opposing predictions, or at least incompatible predictions that that cannot kind of take place at the same time. So, and the proponents of the 2 theories, the adversaries, gave their agreement, you know, in advance. So, you know, they might then at the end say, well, that's not what I thought would happen, but everything would be transparent because everyone would know exactly what were the expectations at the start and where they ended up. So I think the nice thing about this endeavor, which we hope that many others would follow, is that it's based, first of all, on team science. So we have many people working together in order to solve this question, because it's a huge question. And what I've learned in my own small attempts to tackle it is that I cannot solve it by myself. And I'm not saying that we will solve it now, but I hope that we will make a step towards that. The idea of adversarial collaboration, I should tell you, it's been an amazing experience to kind of go back and forth between them and see how they start to interpret each other's results and relate to the theories and try to challenge each other intellectually. It's a very nice endeavor. We have the 3 different techniques, and that would actually generate a very large data set of 500, we hope, subjects for fMRI, combined fMRI, MEG, and ECOG, and we will release it to the entire community so people could curate it, and it would be interesting even irrespective of consciousness, using the same task across 3 different neural techniques to see how the fMRI can inform the EEG and so on. I said 500 subjects, so this is a highly powered design which go way beyond what we typically know in the field. Everything is pre-registered and open science, and we have an in-house replication. So what we do, beyond having 2 different labs, independent labs, by the way, that are not affiliated with any of the theories, beyond having 2 different labs per techniques, so we have like between labs replication, we also, what we do is that we play with the first half of the data. So now what we are doing now is try to, every kind of, not now, because now we are still analyzing, acquiring the data. But once we have the data, we can try every analysis we want in order to tap the predictions. After we are finished with half of the data, we amend the pre-registration, we add the protocol, the detailed protocol of the analysis, and then we test it on the second half. So we also have that way of replication. And as I said before, it's a huge team. So I want to acknowledge first, of course, Giulio and Stan Tononi and Dehan for having the courage to be the first to put their theories on the line and commit to these predictions in advance. Also, as I said before, Dave Chalmers and Francis Fallon and Hal Blumenfeld, who have been with us in the Seattle project, in the Seattle meeting to begin with. The first I want to acknowledge are the students and postdocs who are working on this project. I don't know why. So Aya and David from the fMRI team, Oscar and Link from the MEG team, Katerina and Alex from the ECOG team, Ursula, Chaba, and Roni from the data monitoring team, who are doing, of course, the actual work, working in the labs of Hal Blumenfeld and Floris DeLange and Ole Jensen, Juan Lu, Gabriel Kreiman, and Sasha Devore, and all the other research assistants and students, and of course also the advisors that we have helping us make sure that we have the best kind of analysis tools in order to find the results. So we hope that this would help the field make a step forward, that this also kind of meets some of the challenges that we found in our analysis of the field by having theory-driven experiments that test more than one theory and set out in advance in order to not only confirm, but also challenge theories. And I want to thank Itai for his great work and the entire Cogitate consortium, and especially, as I said before, Lucia and Mike, who are just brilliant scientists, and I'm happy to work with. All the group is brilliant, but I work with Lucia and Mike all the time, so I want to mention them as well. And of course, my lab. I've been very fortunate to have excellent students, and that's also a good point to say that I'm looking for postdocs. So if you are interested in trying to explore the wonders of consciousness, then send me an email, because I'll be happy to discuss that. And now I'm, of course, very happy to answer questions.
Brilliant. Oh, thanks so much, Liad. This was really fantastic talk. So we should first unmute ourselves and give you a round of applause.